Supreme Court issued two key rulings today, both of them having to do with the president's financial records.
The court ruled that President Trump must cooperate with the Manhattan District Attorney's investigation into his finances.
Nearly 133,000 Americans now dead from the coronavirus.
Welcome to Foursquare, the digital video show you can only find right here on Politico. My name is Eugene Daniels, your host, and joining me as always are my colleagues Tim Alberta and Laura Barone Lopez. Ryan Liz is out and Elena Schneider is joining us in his stead.
Elena, thanks for stepping in and taking over for Ryan this week.
So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Another big upgrade.
We've had Alex Thompson and Elena Schneider. Elena's an upgrade from Alex also, I would say.
Yes.
Wait, pause. Oh my gosh.
Never
Trying to give her compliments.
Yeah, I take that back.
And my tenure is over.
And we're done here. I wanted to start with COVID-19 because America continues to see an uptick in cases, hospitalizations around the country, though deaths do seem to be trending downward. First, for our viewers, I want to share some stats about where we are numbers-wise. Worldwide, more than 12 million people have gotten the coronavirus, more than 500,000 have died. Here in the US, new infections are headed up in 35 states, and more than 3 million people in America have gotten COVID-19, and more than 132,000 have died. This is happening as states all around the country are starting to reopen, and President Trump continues to downplay the danger of the virus, saying almost all of the cases are totally harmless, is what he's been saying, which is not true. Laura, I want to start with you on this topic. You and Elena have a story out today about how no matter where COVID-19 hits, Black and brown communities are hit the hardest every single time. For a bit there, the chattering class, the swamp, was talking about how the red states are now being hit hardest. And I think the implication was, Trump's base or white rural people are getting hit worse. And that's not the case at all, is it?
Coronavirus, this whole entire pandemic has been politicized by national leaders, by state leaders. And as we saw the shift in the number of increasing cases from politically blue states to politically red states, we're talking about Arizona, Texas, and Florida, the conversation started, pundits and political watchers started saying that Trump country was under siege. And yes, those are states that voted for Trump, but that really hides this deeper reality, which is that Black, Latino, Native American populations are bearing the brunt of this disease and are being disproportionately hit across the board in Arizona, in Texas, in Arkansas, in Alabama. And just to give some of the numbers on that, in Maricopa County, which is the most populous county in Arizona, Latinos are 50% of the cases, and there are some 39% of the hospitalizations, and yet they're only roughly about 30% or so of the population. And then in Alabama, Black people are 27% of the population, but they're 45% of the deaths due to coronavirus. So you're seeing this across the board, and Elena and I spoke to health officials, public health experts, and local political officials across these states about the disproportionate impact and about what they're doing to try to address it, whether it's PSAs that are more culturally competent, increasing testing. But again, there are issues with testing in terms of access as well as how long it takes to even get results. So these issues are far from being addressed. Yes, I did.
You got a test.
And I still don't have the results.
And it's been almost 2 weeks?
Yeah, it's 2 weeks today.
Wow.
That's wild.
No results. And you got your test in DC.
That's right, at one of the free testing sites. And it just speaks to, my example speaks to what we're hearing across the country, which is that so many people are having to wait, 8-10 days or more to get results. And at that point, they could already be exhibiting really horrible symptoms, or they could be asymptomatic and spreading it to others and not know that they're asymptomatic.
Elena, a group that has been getting almost zero attention in mainstream media that you guys covered in this story are Native Americans. They're being admitted to hospitals at a higher rate than other marginalized groups, especially when you take into account the population and how many Native Americans are in the country. What do we know about why it's hitting them this hard?
So you're right. Native Americans, just like Black and Brown people, are disproportionately being hurt by this virus. And they're sort of getting the worst of both worlds, both on the health front and also on the economy, that they're feeling it more deeply than most Americans. So on the health front, just like other minority communities, they are disproportionately more likely to have less access to quality health care. They're more likely to have underlying health conditions that then puts them at a higher risk and then needing to go to the hospital at higher rates. And they're also more likely to live within intergenerational families in smaller quarters. So therefore, it's easier for this virus, one person in a family to get it, easier for it to spread. They are at 6 times the rate of white people getting hospitalized. Black and brown people are at 5 times the rate of getting hospitalized compared to white people. In terms of the economic impact, I mean, look, a lot of Native American communities are very much involved in sort of the service industry and tourism. Those are 2 worlds that are being devastated by the coronavirus and the pandemic and the need to shut down our economy to try and address this. And chief among them is casinos, which is where a huge amount of revenue comes from these tribes, so that they can then go on to run their tribal governments, can run their own health clinics. If that, as that money has dried up, it's made it a lot more difficult for them to not only sort of survive just within families, but also keep their healthcare systems running.
Tim, President Trump continues to tweet that the only reason we have the most cases in the world is because of bigger and better testing. That's quoting from him, and that's experts say that's not true. He's now disavowing his own administration's guidelines for reopening schools in the fall, saying he's even open to slashing federal funding if physical schools don't reopen. How does a country fix a crisis that's hitting all of these very already marginalized groups and everyone else when you have the president say the exact opposite of what experts in and outside of his administration are saying?
It doesn't, to be clear. I mean, and look, I think we should all understand that a competent response from a competent administration does not alone solve the coronavirus, right? This is a global health pandemic, but competent leadership and coherent messaging from the top would certainly help. And we haven't seen that, at least not on any sort of a consistent basis. And so what you see over the past week with the president messaging about schools needing to reopen, about disavowing CDC guidelines, the vice president, trying his game best to sort of bridge this impossible divide. And this is just not what Americans are accustomed to in a situation of crisis. Whether you voted for Donald Trump or didn't vote for Donald Trump, it's bizarre to hear the president contradicting what the nation's leading public health officials are saying. And it's particularly, I think, jarring for people to recognize that it is being politicized, not just in the sense that it was being politicized at the start about red states versus blue states and urban versus rural and everything else, but this push to reopen schools is part of what has been a broader push to reopen the economy, which is in and of itself political, obviously, because the president recognizes the existential threat that this ongoing crisis poses to his reelection prospects. And he is right to sense that threat. Not only is the coronavirus, killing Americans, it's killing his political prospects. His handling of COVID-19 has been panned across the board, including by groups that voted for him in 2016, particularly white seniors over 65. I mean, the writing is on the wall here politically, and the president and his team, they understand that if they do not do something to turn the narrative here, then he is not going to be reelected this November.
Well, and another thing that I heard time and again from experts was that you really can't separate opening the economy and combating the virus. Those are inextricably linked. So if he has any hope of changing the narrative around the economy and the economy reopening, he has to figure out some way to sort of make peace with the fact that that comes with certain restrictions, like wearing a mask. I mean, Harris County Judge Lina Hidalgo, who's the top Democrat out of Harris County in Texas, said, let's just get them all MAGA masks. Why not just sort of embrace it? Because at the end of the day, that's the only way that the economy is going to be able to truly open. Otherwise, we're going to spend the next, I don't know how many more months sort of taking a few steps forward and then taking several steps backwards.
Next up, we're going to do counter programming, a segment we do every week. Elena, you are our guest host, so we're going to start with you. This is where I give you guys a little bit of time, don't get crazy, 30 to 45 seconds to talk about something that we haven't been able to drill down in on this episode. Elena, we'll start with you.
Well, I'm going to cheat a little bit because we did talk about opening schools a little bit because they're all sort of linked together in this story about the coronavirus. But this weekend, I was with my sister who has, down in North Carolina, she's got 3 little ones, one who just turned 7, and she was just given basically 2 weeks by Wake County to decide whether or not to put her daughter back in school for some sort of like 50% or so capacity, or choose to do virtual school. That's very little time for parents to make an incredibly important decision. And look, I'm not a parent, but I really feel for all these people who are sort of freaking out at home. How do you balance sending your kid to school, their health, your ability to keep doing your job? I mean, this is a very difficult moment. This is going to be an ongoing sort of crisis and problem for parents and schools as they try to navigate this. And I don't think we've even sort of begun to think about what that is really going to look like and how that's even going to happen logistically. But I think it's going to drive a lot of conversation as we head into the fall.
Yeah. Laura, how about you?
I'm going to plug another story I worked on this week with my colleague Holly Otterbein. So Biden released his platform of proposals for climate change, immigration, criminal justice reform that they plan to adopt at the convention. We wrote a story about the criminal justice reform proposals, particularly the fact that out of all the task forces, which was a joint effort by Sanders appointees and Biden appointees, criminal justice was the one area where Biden moved the least left on, particularly on the issue of ending qualified immunity, which allows police officers to be shielded from lawsuits for misconduct, as well as legalizing marijuana, a favorite topic for everyone. So Biden decided not to support the legalization of marijuana. He decided to support decriminalization. And on ending qualified immunity, a lot of progressives were frustrated that the Biden campaign only wanted to go so far as say that they want to rein it in, which we're not entirely sure what that would look like. And so they're hopeful that given that flexibility, that if he were elected, progressives think that maybe they can push him whenever he's finally in the White House if he wins.
Tim, how about you?
Somebody's going to play this game by the rules. Okay. What we saw last Sunday with Tammy Duckworth declining.
The first time.
What? Okay, hold on. Now I can start over. You're This is my time, okay? On the Senate floor, I will not yield.
You reclaim your time.
I'll reclaim my time. So last Sunday on CNN, when Tammy Duckworth was asked whether she would support tearing down statues of George Washington, she said, well, that's a conversation we should have, which I think was a totally unforced error and very likely, I think, probably takes her out of the running to be Joe Biden's VP. And then what you saw very predictably after that sort of caricature of an episode was the right overreaching, Tucker Carlson questioning her patriotism. It was, in a nutshell, everything that is wrong with our politics in 2020. Boom.
Oh!
That's the first time. That is the first time you've ever met 30 seconds.
Our last mega segment today is something that literally broke less than 2 hours before we started recording this episode. The Supreme Court delivered a split decision on subpoenas for President Trump's tax returns, both with the 7-2 majority, which never happens in the Supreme Court cases right now. So first, in regards to a criminal case in New York, the court is allowing prosecutors to access those documents, but they will likely be shielded under some grand jury secrecy rules. The president's team has claimed absolute immunity from all criminal proceedings and investigations while he's president. The Supreme Court clearly thinks otherwise. The court also ruled that lower courts didn't do enough to scrutinize congressional subpoenas. House Democrats were looking for similar records here. So Congress won't be getting their hands on those documents anytime soon. That case will be going back to the lower courts. Elena, we likely won't see these tax returns until after the election, if we ever see them at all. So you'd have to assume this all kind of ties itself back into how people already think about President Trump on both sides. Does it do anything at all to sway the election or sway in the valued independence?
So I think you laid it out perfectly. Basically, in the short term, Trump got what he wanted, which is this effort to delay, and push off after November. It's not likely that we're going to see anything from any of this while he is in office or while he's still running for president in 2020. That being said, long term, if he gets indicted, those things get unsealed, all of a sudden it's a whole other case. But I think ultimately, even if we were suddenly going to get his tax returns through Congress or some other way, if they were given that ability, I don't think ultimately it would have much of an impact. I think where voters, the people who would be upset about that are the people who are already going to be voting against him. And I think where the real change in his fortunes came in terms of particularly among older people and among independent voters, areas that he managed to win in 2016 has been his handling of this pandemic.
President Trump has been the only presidential candidate in modern history to not release his tax returns while running. He claimed they're under audit, but there's really nothing keeping him from giving those out while he was under audit, experts say. Tim, President Trump is pissed. He's been tweeting all morning about this case in caps, but what can the campaign do to make sure to keep him on the path to winning, trying to win?
Well, so look, a couple of things. You mentioned that he's the only presidential candidate in history to conceal his tax returns. Also, the only presidential candidate in history to preemptively release a list of people that he would consider naming to the Supreme Court. And that was a core part of his messaging in 2016. He is now robbed of what was, I think, a critical piece of the puzzle in bringing a lot of reluctant Republicans along in November of 2016, which was this idea that the court was literally hanging in the balance. That was an essential part of the Trump-Pence argument and an essential part of the argument made by Republican leaders nationally, people who thought Trump was sort of morally and personally abhorrent, that, listen, at the very least, what you're going to get out of this guy is a conservative Supreme Court that is going to be there upholding our values long after he is out of office. And the irony, of course, built into all of this is that if there is one institution in American life that has been a bulwark against the conservative agenda over the last 3.5 years, it has been the Supreme Court. The American people are going to find out what's in Donald Trump's tax returns. It's just a matter of time. A grand jury is not leak-proof. I think we know that. What it does is it makes any messaging from the Trump campaign about court appointments ring somewhat hollow in the ears of conservatives, particularly social conservatives, who have watched this Trump-occupied Supreme Court rule against them time and time again over the last few years.
Yeah. Laura, to the Democrats, how carefully do House Democrats used to cover Congress? How carefully do they need to proceed here as their subpoenas and their case heads back to the lower courts? Is there a risk they just kind of fulfill Trump's claims of a witch hunt and presidential harassment, which he's been tweeting over and over and over again? Like, do they run a risk of seem like they're overreaching if they just keep pushing at this?
Well, I mean, the subpoenas that are now going back to the lower court, like those are in a pending pattern pretty much. So we have to wait to see what happens. But what was interesting about the Supreme Court ruling too is that it showed that the court is willing, which was a question before this, is willing to wade into disputes between the executive and the legislative. And there was questions about whether or not they were going to be willing to do that. And then the court also rejected pretty much this broad interpretation. So this speaks to your question about Eugene, which this broad interpretation by Congress for their subpoena power in instances like this, and pretty much saying that there have to be some limits.
both Gorsuch and Kavanaugh have run in explicitly political circles and in Washington circles for a lot of years. These two understand full well that Donald Trump is looking more and more likely to lose come November, and that they're going to be on the court for probably decades to come, both of them, and that they're going to be dealing with these disputes, as Laura said, between the legislative and the executive time and time and time again. And I think this ruling, as much as anything else, was for them sort of a bit of maneuvering to ensure that when they rule this way with a Democratic president in office, that they are not called out as being hypocritical or inconsistent, that this is sort of an early marker that those two justices are laying down. You notice that Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, the two most conservative members of the court, but also two of the older members of the court who will not be around for a long time, they did not have any such hesitation. There's a significant generational distinction to make there.
Elena, thank you so much for joining us. This was so fun. We'll have to have you on again.
I'd love that. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks for watching. As always, you can find us right here every Thursday covering politics as only Politico can.